Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Taking a closer look at sources you send us, really digging into the theological structure that might be hiding, just beneath the surface. Today we're tackling a bit of scripture that, let's be honest, most people probably skim through. Matthew chapter 1. And specifically, we're zoning in on verse 17, that little summary sentence right after the long list of Jesus' ancestors. I bet our listener, like me, has probably powered through those 16 verses of begats at some point. And you see verse 17 is just, well, the bookkeeper's note at the end, right? Just tallying up the names you just waded through. Seems like simple accounting. But what I want us to stress today is that Matthew 1.15 is way more than that. Structurally, it's like the theological headline for the whole story Matthew's about to tell. It doesn't just count history, it actually turns history into a kind of map, a map of redemptive time.
That's a great way to put it, a map. We're looking at verse 17 not as some kind of appendix, but as the, let's say, interpretive capstone on top of that list of names. And it's also a hermeneutical key. It unlocks the theological setup for the whole birth narrative that follows. See, Matthew is giving us this highly stylized arrangement of Israel's story. He breaks time down into three symmetrical sections. And he does this, it seems, to show us that history isn't just random stuff happening. It's a ruled procession. It's marching somewhere specific. And the verse itself tells us the destination very clearly. It culminates unto the Christ.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. We need to unpack the architecture of this verse. Why this structure? Why the number 14 repeated like that? What's the big crisis sitting right in the middle of this historical map? And how does this whole structured history actually preach God's providence? Which, for listeners familiar with the Westminster Confession, connects straight to the teaching in chapter 5.
Right. Let's get into it.
So let's unpack this architecture you mentioned. Matthew isn't just giving us a, straightforward list of names, first to last. He's framing it. It's like a carefully balanced structure with three parts, a tricolon. He's taking centuries of history and compressing it into three distinct equal periods.
That's right. He organizes the whole sweep of salvation history, from Abraham all the way to the Messiah, into these three specific epochs or spans of time. The structure is built around clear boundary markers. So the first era, that covers the age of promise and foundation. It runs from Abraham to David. This is when the covenants get established, the nation forms, and it all leads up to that golden age of the kingdom under David.
Then we get to the middle section.
The second era. This is the age of kingship and then, collapse. It goes from David to the deportation to Babylon. So this covers the time of the united monarchy, then the divided kingdom, and it's increasingly marked by disobedience, by covenant failure.
Right, things start falling apart.
And then finally, the third era. This one often feels a bit hazy in Old Testament history, doesn't it? It's the age of waiting and fulfillment, from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ.
And what's really striking is how uniform Matthew makes this. He doesn't just give the total number at the very end. He actually repeats the result for each section. Each one ends with the same phrase, 14 generations.
Yes, exactly that. The repetition is obviously intentional. It's a rhetorical technique. There's a technical term for repeating the same phrase at the end of successive clauses called epistrophe. And Matthew uses it here almost like a hammer hitting an anvil. Boom, 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 14, 14, 14. It forces you to notice the rhythm, the cadence. It's meant to etch that pattern into your memory, so the symmetry is just undeniable.
Which brings us right to the main question. Why 14? Why that number? If Matthew was just listing names, he'd use whatever number came up. But the source material we looked at is very clear. The number 14 isn't random. It's a Davidic signature. Now, for anyone listening who hasn't come across this idea before, it depends on something called gematria. Can you break down that connection, David's name and 14, simply?
Sure. It comes down to an ancient Jewish practice, gematria. Letters in the Hebrew alphabet also stood for numbers. It was a known way of finding deeper meaning in texts.
Okay.
So if you take the three consonants in David's Hebrew name, that's Daleth, Wah, Daleth. The letter Daleth, that's worth 4. The letter Wah is worth 6. So you have Daleth 4 plus Wah 6 plus another Daleth 4. Add them up.
4 plus 6 plus 4 is 14. Got it.
Right. So the number is literally embedded in the name itself.
So this wasn't just some kind of ancient number game. It was a way of making a theological statement using the letters themselves.
It was. And this gives us the main theological effect of this symmetry. By repeating 14 3 times, Matthew creates this rhythm that just stamps David all over Israel's history. He turns the whole list, as one source put it, into something like a royal banner. It acts like a memory aid, a refrain, telling the reader, see this structure, think David. And if you think David...
You think Messiah, the promised king from David's line.
Correct. So the architecture itself, becomes a statement of faith about who Jesus is, his royal status.
And this measured structure, the symmetry, speaks volumes about God's control over time, doesn't it? His sovereignty.
It connects straight to the doctrine of providence, that perfect symmetry, the measured, stylized pattern of three equal sections. That's Matthew's primary way of signaling that history isn't chaotic. It's measured and governed by God's design. This structure preaches the certainty of God's wise rule, just like WCFV says, that the means and the ends were ordered together towards a specific promised outcome. And that outcome is the Messiah. Matthew is basically telling us God was ruling over the rise of the kingdom in the first section. He was ruling over its collapse and judgment in the second. And he was ruling over that long, quiet waiting period in the third. All of it was part of the plan, ordered to bring about the arrival of the Christ. The structure tells us, no matter how messy things look on the ground, God's count is always right.
But that very structural tightness, that perfection, leads to the big question people always raise. What about historical accuracy? I mean, to get this perfect 14-14-14 pattern, Matthew clearly had to select names, right? He had to condense the list. It can look a bit like he's, well, fudging the numbers.
This is a fair point, and we need to think about the kind of writing this is. Matthew definitely did select names. Our notes call it telescoping names. But we argue this isn't an error. It's a recognized way of writing these lists back then. This kind of compression is actually pretty standard in biblical genealogies. You see similar things in, say, the genealogy in Ruth chapter 4 or in 1 Chronicles 3. Matthew's using an accepted covenantal way of listing ancestors.
Okay, but wait. If he has to leave out, 3 or 4 actual historical kings just to hit his target number of 14, isn't that manipulating the facts? How do we see that as okay without just dismissing the history?
We see it as okay by understanding Matthew's goal. His main concern isn't to give us a complete, exhaustive civil register like a modern census taker might. His aim is theological design and structure. He's carefully curating the royal line, the line that passes down the legal right to David's throne. And to do that, sometimes these lists focus on the big turning points or the key covenant figures, and they might skip over kings whose reigns were maybe less significant theologically, or maybe even seen as cut off from the main promise.
So he's selecting for a reason, for teaching.
Right, for didactic purposes. He wants to teach us something about God's timing and God's plan centered on David's line.
Let's get specific then. Which names did he have to omit to make the numbers work? Especially in that middle section, the age of kingship.
Right, to keep that middle panel symmetrical running from David down to the Babylonian deportation, Matthew did have to telescope. The most well-known omission is the gap between King Joram and King Uzziah. If you check the historical record, like in Kings or Chronicles, there are actually 3 kings between them: Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah.
3 kings skipped over. Is there maybe a theological reason why those 3 might be left out? Was there something specific about that group?
Well, there's a pretty strong possibility, yes. It fits with Old Testament patterns of judgment. Joram, the king listed right before the gap, he married Athaliah. And Athaliah was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, infamous for their wickedness in the northern kingdom. So this marriage brought the corruption of Ahab's house right into the Davidic line in Judah.
Okay, that's not good.
Not good at all. And the 3 kings who followed, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, were all linked to this compromised wicked line stemming from Athaliah. So by leaving them out, Matthew might be making a theological point, that God's judgment effectively cut off that particularly corrupt branch from the official royal line, even though history, continued chronologically. The count then picks up again with Uzziah, marking maybe a reset or a more acceptable phase.
Interesting. And there was one more omission needed, wasn't there?
Yes, later on. Matthew also leaves out King Jehoiakim, who reigned between Josiah and Jeconiah right before the exile. And again, Jehoiakim was known as a particularly bad king. His actions really hurried along Judah's final destruction.
So these omissions aren't random cuts. They seem targeted.
They seem targeted, and they are necessary to keep the spans at 14 each. The omissions prioritize the theological design, the structure, over listing every single person chronologically. Matthew sacrifices completeness in one sense to make sure the story, marked by that Davidic number, leads the reader straight to the Christ. All right, so we've got the symmetry, the 3 epochs, all pointing towards David. Now we really need to zoom in on the pivot point, the absolute center of this whole structure, and that is the Babylonian deportation. Matthew gives this event huge architectural weight. Think of it like the keystone in an arch. It holds everything together. He doesn't just mention it once in verse 17, he names it twice. It's the end point of the second era, from David to the deportation. And it's the starting point of the third era, from the deportation to the Christ. Naming it twice like that really focuses your attention on the exile. This is the crisis moment. This is the ultimate covenant rupture.
And let's look at the specific Greek word Matthew uses here for deportation. It's metoasia, or edo kappa epsilon sigma I alpha. The note suggests this wasn't just any word for exile, it was a very deliberate, theologically loaded choice. It highlights dislocation, not just captivity.
That's right. He could have used a different word, like aishmalusia. That word means captivity or bondage, and it focuses more on being physically held prisoner by another nation.
Okay, so Ikemelusia is about chains, basically.
Yeah.
What does metoakesia bring out instead?
Mekinoikesia is more about relocation, resettlement, or maybe best, dislodgement. By choosing this word, Matthew stresses the covenant dislocation. The crisis isn't just about geography or foreign rule. It's about their relationship with God and their relationship to the Promised Land.
Dislodgement, like being kicked out of your home?
Precisely. The people were driven out of the land of promise. And if you connect that back to the law, back to the Pentateuch, this is the direct fulfillment of the curses listed in the covenant. Think Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28 through 30. Deuteronomy 28 lays out blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. And what's the ultimate curse for breaking the covenant? Expulsion from the land, being scattered among the nations.
So the deportation wasn't just a military defeat or a political disaster. It was, in effect, God serving Israel an eviction notice because they broke the covenant terms.
You can certainly see it that way. The theological weight is huge because it concerns Israel's failure on a national scale. Exile, this metoaikesia, signals a serious estrangement from God's presence. They lost the place where God's glory dwelled. They lost the rest promised in the land. Think about it this way. If the covenant made Israel like God's tenants living in his land, the metoaikesia is the final judgment, confirming they'd broken the lease agreement through repeated, willful sin, and now they were being evicted. The root problem is the relational distance from God that sin always creates. It drove the covenant people away from God's house, so to speak.
And that distance, that rupture, explains why the genealogy, which was so perfectly structured around the Davidic 14, just grinds to a halt at this point. It's the moment the whole covenant project seems judged and shattered because of their unfaithfulness. The nation's story basically hits a wall here until something totally new can start.
And that tension is actually built into the structure through the hinge name, Jeconiah. This king, Jeconiah, also known as Jehoiakim or Coniah, he's the critical transition figure. See, to make the numbers work, Jeconiah gets counted twice in the genealogy. He's counted at the end of Epoch 2. He was the last sort of legitimate king before the main exile happened. And then he's counted again at the start of Epoch 3 as the first representative figure of the line in exile. Counting him twice is necessary to maintain that 14-14-14 symmetry that Matthew is so carefully constructing.
And Jeconiah himself, his personal fate, really sums up that whole covenant curse, that sense of finality in the metoaikesia. We know from Jeremiah the prophet, chapter 22, verse 30 specifically, that God pronounced a really severe curse on him. Jeremiah said that none of Jeconiah's physical descendants would ever prosper, sitting on David's throne or ruling in Judah again.
That's right, a devastating curse.
Which seems to create a massive problem for Matthew's whole argument, doesn't it? If Jesus is the Davidic king, the fulfillment of this whole 14-14-14 structure, how can he descend from Jeconiah's cursed line? This looks like a theological dead end.
It does look like a trap. And this is where Matthew has to show God's providence working in a very specific way. He needs to secure Jesus' legal right to the throne, passed down through Jeconiah's line, while also steering clear of that prophetic curse on Jeconiah's actual offspring. And the structure itself signals the solution. The line does run through Jeconiah and through his descendant Joseph, who becomes Jesus' legal father. But the final step, the fulfillment, requires a break in the biological chain. Jesus gets his legal Davidic sonship through Joseph. That gives him the royal title, the throne right. It confirms he is the legal heir of this measured 14-14-14 history.
But he avoids the curse.
He avoids the curse precisely because he is not Joseph's physical offspring. The virgin conception, which Matthew introduces immediately after finishing the genealogy in verse 18, is the divine solution to the Jeconiah problem. So, counting Jeconiah twice isn't just a numbers game, it's a deliberate technique. It frames the exile perfectly and highlights the need for divine intervention. The story of restoration, Epoch 3, has to begin right where the story of judgment, Epoch 2, ended with Jeconiah. It carries forward the legal title, but signals that God has to do something new to overcome the curse and complete the line.
Okay, so we've walked through the three epochs. We've seen the Davidic signature and the number 14, and we've looked at the central crisis, the meteuchesia, that covenant dislocation symbolized by the exile in Jaconia. Now, all of this careful structuring, all this theological architecture, it's all pointing towards one goal, the telos, unto the Christ.
Yes, the destination is key. It's very intentional that the word Christou, Christ, is the very last word in the Greek sentence of verse 17. It sits in that final climactic spot. The structure itself is saying, all this history, all the counting, the long wait after exile, it all flows towards and finds its resolution in the Messiah. And the use of the definite article to Christou makes it clear this isn't just a name, it's a title. It means the anointed one, the Messiah. The grammar itself feels like a crowning statement at the end of this historical survey.
Right.
And this climax is where the major threads of God's promises, what the Westminster Confession speaks about as the convergence of covenants, WCF 7, all come together in this one person, Jesus.
Let's break down that convergence. The first connection is obvious from the numbers we've been talking about. A, the Davidic fulfillment, kingship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The whole 14-14-14 structure, that Davidic signature, is primarily designed to confirm Jesus as the rightful heir to David's throne. Remember the promise in 2 Samuel 7. God promised David an everlasting house, an everlasting throne. Jesus is presented as the fulfillment of that royal oath. The genealogy acts like the legal preamble, showing the throne line was preserved and counted by God, even through judgment.
And this loops back to Joseph's role, which is crucial but not biological.
His role is absolutely vital here. The sources point out that Joseph, by being Mary's legal husband, and then by officially naming the child Jesus, is the one who confers the legal title, the throne, right onto Jesus. That's how the curse on Jeconiah's physical line is bypassed, while the legal claim to the throne remains valid. Joseph acts as the bridge, carrying the legitimacy of that 14-14-14 structure forward.
Which then sets up maybe Matthew's most brilliant literary and theological move.
What?
The grammatical caesura, the break in the pattern right at verse 16, the third epoch, the post-exile section, just can't end the same way the others did.
It can't.
For 41 names before this, Matthew uses that steady rhythm, the active verb ignosin, meaning X fathered Y. It's like a drumbeat of human procreation. But then, right before Jesus, the formula breaks.
It shatters, really. The Greek text shifts dramatically. Instead of the active ignosin, fathered, it switches to the passive verb ignotha, was born. And critically, it adds the phrase ex his, which means of whom, but it's feminine singular, referring only to Mary.
Ah, of whom Mary was born Jesus. Joseph isn't the subject of the verb there.
No, he's mentioned right before as Mary's husband, but the grammar carefully excludes him from the active generation. This sudden break in the established pattern is Matthew's way of shouting, subtly, that this final birth isn't just another link in the human chain. It required a new act of God. The passive voice was born, and the specific reference to Mary alone, of whom, signaled divine paternity. It points directly to the virgin conception.
So, in one grammatical shift, Matthew achieves two things that seem almost contradictory. He confirms the divine origin of Jesus through the virgin birth, breaking the normal pattern. But he also maintains the legal Davidic lineage through Joseph, fulfilling the 14-14-14 structure. That's quite something.
It's a remarkable demonstration of providence, ordering means and ends together, as the confession puts it, WCFV. Both the legal line and the divine intervention were necessary.
Okay, so that covers the Davidic kingship. What about the second stream of promise that converges here? B, the Abrahamic fulfillment, blessing, and mission. The genealogy started way back with Abraham, not just David. There must be a reason for that, too.
Yes, starting with Abraham is crucial. It keeps the original scope of God's plan in view, that nations in view horizon from Genesis 12.3. The promise that through Abraham's offspring, all the families, all the peoples of the earth would find blessing. So Jesus isn't just the Davidic king for Israel. He's also the ultimate seed of Abraham, through whom that universal blessing is now going to flow out to the whole world. And you see this Abrahamic dimension reach its fulfillment right at the end of Matthew's gospel, don't you? In the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18-20. The risen, enthroned Lord, who now has all authority, sends his people who have been forgiven and restored from their own exile of sin out to make disciples of all nations. The structure, starting with Abraham and ending with Christ the King, guarantees that the kingdom's reach is global.
And, thinking back through the list itself, the inclusion of those specific women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, referred to as the wife of Uriah, they weren't just Israelites, and their stories involved, well, scandal or difficult circumstances. Does that foreshadow this global reach, too?
I think it certainly can be read that way. Their presence in the official royal line signals that God's grace operates even through messy human situations and reaches beyond typical boundaries. It shows that outsider status or moral ambiguity doesn't disqualify people from God's plan. In fact, grace seems to work right through it. It prepares the way for a Messiah whose grace will extend to Gentiles, to sinners, to all kinds of outsiders. The precedent is set within his own family tree.
Okay, so if the metoikesia, the exile, meant covenant dislocation, being driven away from God's presence, then the arrival of Christ, the fulfillment, must mean the opposite. It must mean the complete and permanent reversal of that curse.
It has to. The fulfillment must undo the breach. And this brings us squarely to the resolution Matthew provides immediately following the genealogy, Emmanuel and atonement. Right after establishing Jesus' lineage and divine origin, Matthew quotes Isaiah. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. That's Matthew 1.23.
God with us.
It's the direct opposite, the positive inverse of being expelled from God's presence. If exile meant distance from God, removal from the land where he dwelled, then Emmanuel means that covenant presence is now restored, permanently, in the person of this king. The curse of distance is canceled because God himself has drawn near.
But just having God nearby isn't quite enough, is it? The reason they were exiled in the first place, their sin, their breaking of the covenant that still needs to be dealt with.
That's the absolutely critical piece. Presence requires purity. And Matthew stated Jesus' mission very clearly, even before the Emmanuel quote, back in verse 21. The angel tells Joseph that this child will save his people from their sins. Sin and guilt cause the metoikesia. Only forgiveness can truly end the state of exile.
Right.
And this is where the whole theological structure lands on the necessity of exile ending atonement. Thinking again about the confession, WCF, XI on justification, and XV on repentance. Jesus himself interprets his own death in these terms. At the Last Supper, in Matthew's account, Jesus says his blood is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins, Matthew 26.28.
Forgiveness of sins, that's the key phrase. Let's use that debt analogy again. Maybe that helps make the connection clear.
Okay. Think of the Babylonian deportation as the massive debt sentence, the consequence of breaking the covenant. That resulted in the people losing the land and being sent away. It's a legal judgment. When Jesus sheds his blood for the forgiveness of sins, that forgiveness acts as the legal cancellation of the covenant breach. It's the payment that satisfies the debt.
So his death pays off the sin debt that caused the exile in the first place.
In essence, yes. Jesus acts as the Redeemer who pays the price. You could almost see it like him signing the release papers, maybe like a Jubilee release that cancels the debt of sin, and he signs it with his own blood. This forgiveness restores the broken fellowship, it makes the Emmanuel presence possible and permanent, and it completely reverses the effects of the metoikesia. The exile is over, not just geographically, but spiritually and legally.
So it all comes together in Christ as the mediator, thinking WCF 8. He's the king who fulfills the Davidic promise, but he's also the one who fulfills the Abrahamic mission to bless the nations. And he secures all these promises by stepping into that history, marked by exile and curse, bearing the curse himself through his death, and thereby bringing his people home legally reconciled and spiritually renewed.
That's the argument Matthew is building. The whole measured history promise leading to the throne leading to the curse of exile, and the exile leading eventually to fulfillment in Christ. It's a demonstration. It shows that God's plan wasn't derailed by human sin or the catastrophe of exile. It confirms God's wise and sovereign rule, guiding everything step by step, generation by generation, directly and purposefully to the Christ. Tag outro.
Well, this deep dive into just one verse, Matthew 1.17, really shows that this genealogy is so much more than just a list of names to skip over. It's like a carefully written liturgy of hope. It teaches us about the certainty of God's providence that we should hold on to. I think the big takeaway is seeing that confession build right into the structure, that pattern, 14, 14, 14, it's Matthew declaring. History is measured by God. History is directed with deliberate divine intention straight towards the Christ. The math itself is a statement of faith. God ordered every step, every generation, all the means, and all the ends to meet in the Messiah.
And there's real pastoral comfort in that structure too, isn't there? We mentioned those women in the list, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. Their inclusion, women who were Gentiles or involved in morally complex situations, preaches a strong message about scandalous grace. It shows that things like scandal or being an outsider, they don't stop God's grace. If anything, grace seems to work right through them. It demonstrates that the Messiah's own lineage carried the marks of human sin and failure, precisely so that he could come and heal all of us who are marked by sin and live as exiles, offering grace.
The whole structure really is designed to stabilize our faith, isn't it? like WCFEF suggests about providence. Even when history looks dark or when God's plan seems hidden or delayed, we're called to trust in his measured, sovereign hand guiding things.
And that brings us to maybe a final thought to ponder. Think about that third epoch, the period after the exile, from the deportation to Christ. Many of the names Matthew lists there are pretty obscure. We don't know much about them from the Old Testament record. They lived during a long, quiet period of waiting, maybe seemed insignificant from a human perspective. Yet Matthew counted them meticulously, 14 generations worth. Perhaps that very obscurity, that long silence, actually served to heighten the anticipation for Christ's arrival as the true goal. So maybe Matthew's arithmetic gives us a clue for our own lives, for the life of the church. Just like that seemingly quiet post-exilic period, there might be times in our lives or in church history that feel obscure, maybe unproductive, like a long period of waiting, thinking of WCF, a seventh on perseverance. But Matthew's structure reassures us. Those times are still measured. They are still counted by God. They are secured by our enthroned King. He governs our days, even the quiet ones, and he will bring his plan, his count, to its completion in everlasting rest. Matthew's careful numbering is like a signal to us. Keep persevering. Trust that the same God who measured Israel's history so precisely is just as precisely governing your life, right here, right now.